so many amazing people talking about all of the changes that we're going to see in the future on so many levels are phenomenal. And we've seen speakers talking about the different skills we're going to need. We've seen speakers talking about changes in technology and how those tools can support us. We've seen speakers talking about the legal framework and how that's changing. But what I want to do today is to really talk about what I see as the missing piece of the jigsaw. And it's something that's messy, and it's raw, and it's vulnerable, and sometimes it's just completely inconvenient, but it's something we're all really good at, and that is being human. And it's a bit that we haven't kind of really touched on. We touched on it a bit here and there today, but we haven't thought about it in detail, and the impact that actually our humanity is going to have when we start to see the world of work changing at the rate that it's changing. So I'm feeling a lot of this right now, not feeling very resilient, ironically, but fear. Fear is something that actually, for us to be really productive, for us to fulfill our potential, we need to understand the basis of fear. We need to understand the role that fear has. We are designed in terms of an evolution basis. We're designed to respond to threats, to changes in the environment, to things that we can't control. There's a part of our brain which is called the amygdala, and it basically produces our emotional response to stress, to things that are changing, that are beyond our control. And it causes us to become very hyper alert, it causes our heart rate to increase, our breathing to change. It also starts to have a real impact on which bits of our brain are working. So the instinctual parts of our brain basically outpace the bits that do all the logical reasoning and the rational thought and things like that. So our prefrontal cortex, the bit at the front, it's all about how do we make decisions, how do we solve problems, how do things like those skills that people have been talking about today, like critical thinking, it's all controlled by that front part of the brain. But when we start to become fearful, it starts to be outpaced. Our instinctual, predetermined behaviours that we've heard about today, they start to kick in. And when we think about it in the context of work, what that means is, actually, we get far worse at making decisions. Our immune systems are very hugely compromised. We also start to see things like, we're less able to fight infections. We are more likely to end up with things like tumours developing, etc. And we start to experience stress and fear in relation to changes to our environment when we start to lose that sense of control. So, in the context of today, what does that mean? We've already talked about how things are rapidly changing. We saw that really inspiring film about how actually the pace of change is so much quicker than we've ever seen before. So, this model was developed by an American psychologist, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she initially started to develop it when she was exploring the acceptance of human beings to the grief process. But it's since been widely applied to how human beings respond to changes in their environment. So as you can see, we start off with initial shock at the surprise, the event has actually occurred. We've moved through the situation where we go through denial and disbelief and complete bewilderment at what we're seeing in front of us. That then leads into frustration, sometimes outbursts of anger. And then finally, we start to see a dip where people they can call it the depression phase, but morale is at an all-time low, energy is low, mood is low, until finally we start to see individuals initially engaging with the new situation, starting to find ways around, starting to make decisions, starting to become more positive, until eventually those changes are starting to be integrated into the way that individual works or how that individual is. So just to put this, I wanted to put it in the context of futurist thinking. I wanted to put it into the context of, well, what's going to happen next? What's going to be the situation for my children? If we look at, this is Ray Kurzweil, he's a really famous futurist, he's worked for Google and, really inspiring guy. But one of the things that he talks about in his law of accelerating returns is this idea that actually, as human beings, we think linearly. We are designed to think linearly. And when we think linearly, when we count linearly, 1, 2, 3, 4. Step 30, we reach 30. Simple. However, we've already heard today, technology is increasing in its capacity at an exponential rate. What that means is 1, 2, 4, 8. By step 30, we're already at 1 billion. So in terms of our capacity as human beings to predict those changes and to control those changes, we obviously need to start thinking about the implications of that. So what's our answer? For me, looking at the research data that's come out recently, looking at the growing evidence base, it points to one thing, and that's resilience. How can we build resilience? How can we build resilience within organisations? And resilience isn't just responding to a one-time crisis. It's not a discrete project that simply happens and, oh, we're done with that, great, we can go back to how we were before. It's about continually adjusting, continually anticipating what's going to come next. You know, it's about organisations actually working towards their future rather than having to defend its past. And so we're starting to think about resilience and well-being as something that is more dynamic, as something that's going to support this process. So what are the characteristics needed that are associated with resilience? The first is confidence. Is an individual competent in what they're doing? Can they cope with stress? Are their positive and negative emotions balanced? And all of this is really, really important for implications for relationships in the workplace, which we've heard is so important today. Adaptability is the next thing. How adaptable are those individuals? How flexible are they? How able are they to respond to changes which are beyond their control? How well do they cope? How quickly do they recover? Purposeful. Do those individuals have clear values? Do they have drive? Do they have direction? Can they persist and achieve even in the face of adversity? And finally, social support, one that perhaps we don't acknowledge as much as we could. But we already know that good relationships matter. But do those people seek support in those relationships? When they're facing adversity, do they try and work in isolation, or do they actually start to pull on the network that they have around them? So resilient individuals are better equipped to deal with the stresses in a constantly changing workplace environment, as they are open to new experiences, are flexible to changing demands, and show more emotional stability when faced with adversity. Michael Lowe, basically, he did a piece of work on this. He collected an awful lot of research data in his Re-engineering of Work book, and he used it to replot the Kubler-Ross change curve. And I think you'll see the outcomes are really astounding. What he found was that actually, if we look, when we have individuals being supported, and by supported I mean that there are some interventions that are associated with resilience and well-being on a continual basis that are integrated into organisations, you can see, in comparison to unsupported change, it dips far less. They are far likely, they don't go as far down into the negative impact, and they recover much more quickly. What that means for an organisation is huge. It means that not only in a transformation process are changes going to be accelerated, but they are also going to be less negative impacts during that process. Now, if we think about that in the big scheme of things, that can have an impact on not only managing stress within the workplace, absenteeism, productivity, and the sort of predictions that I've seen around have been looking at, well, actually, if we had a 1% gain, only a 1% gain as a result of bringing well-being and resilience into the workplace and integrating it into our daily work practices, that would have huge implications. But people are suggesting that actually, by bringing in these methods of support, the potential gains are even greater than that. So what does it actually look like? If we use resilience as a buffer for change, what does that actually look like? So if you see in the orange on the left-hand side, we've got the traditional change that we have in some organisations, and your organisation might be different. But this is generally what we're sort of seeing. This is some of the research that's been done in the last 10, 15 years. And so we see actually we've got individuals who are being managed and led from the top. We're relying on structures and systems that are firmly in place, motivating through financial incentives. Again, I've mentioned the idea of change being seen as something as a discrete project, a transformation agenda. And we're ensuring that actually, yes, it's all the change that we're doing is in line with our people policy, well, meeting HR requirements, etc., etc. Whereas a resilient organisation would approach things slightly differently. They look at how can they provide their employees with clear direction? How can they increase collaboration? How can they increase individual engagement? How can they support well-being and resilience? How can they integrate all of this into the way that they do HR, into their development processes and the way that they manage personal development for individuals? And how can they really embed well-being and resilience into everyday working life? So for me, this kind of summarised the business case, I guess, for well-being and resilience. And it's actually Robertson Cooper, the business psychologist, that put this together. And they looked at, here's the essentials on the left-hand side. What do we need in terms of your hierarchy of needs for the workplace on the left-hand side? In the centre, you can see the impact in terms of physical health and psychological well-being, and then finally engagement. And all of these things have been shown to have a significant impact on business outcomes. This is not just stuff that I'm making up. This is stuff that's backed up by hard data. And that evidence base is growing and growing. So, Netflix. I'm assuming everyone's heard of Netflix here? So it was interesting, the CEO of Netflix, Reed Hastings, he made a presentation in 2012, and it was probably seen as one of the most influential presentations to come out of Silicon Valley that year. What was interesting was that he just talked about how they did business at Netflix. And it was really simple. It was a really simple presentation. There were no great adornments. It was black and white. And, but the reason it made such an impact is because of what he actually said. And he talked about how at Netflix, they don't have job descriptions. They did away with job descriptions, and they used the umbrella arching terms of freedom and responsibility. And they gave people the tools in order to embrace autonomy, in order to be able to do their job effectively and manage themselves. And this was kind of seen in a variety of different ways. So, for example, their time off policy, they gave people 10 vacation days, 10 holidays, and a few sick days. And they basically ran like, or they still do, an honour system where employees basically were expected to just keep track of their own days. They'd let people know when they were going to be out, but it was sort of like a hedge veg, if you like, of time off. And so they basically allowed people to make those decisions for themselves. Senior leaders were actively encouraged to take vacations. They were seen as role models. It was seen as so important that actually they were celebrated for taking time away from the office. If we look at the way that they did travel and expenses accounts as well, you know, the only policy that they had for that were five words long. Act in Netflix best interests. That's all it was. And it shifted the responsibility to the individuals, and as a result, they saw costs significantly reduced. Again, all adding to profitability for Netflix. So, what does this mean for the future? We've heard about millennials a lot today, and Generation Z. So individuals who are coming into the workplace, who have entered the workplace a few years ago, they have very different demands. We know that. The research is already telling us that. And one of the things that we see is that they are looking for organisations to work with who are more aligned with their own individual values. And they are more likely to invest in them as employees and invest in their personal development. If you look at millennials, the research that's coming out at the moment suggests that they have very different sets of values in terms of what they expect from their employees and their organisations. So, for example, they are more likely to take time off to support their family, perhaps ageing or ill relatives, for example. they also are looking for roles where they can make more of a social impact than people previously had done in previous generations. And so organisations need to think perhaps a bit differently about what do they hold that's going to be attractive to these new generations coming in. And one of the key things that we're seeing that comes up time and time again, has been mentioned today, is this whole idea of values and sharing values and feeling that you're truly aligned with the organisation, you're collaborating and moving along the lines on the same journey. One of the things that organisations are starting to explore is actually how can we change our structures to, rather than values just being a list of things that we sort of put on the wall, hey, this is what we do, come into our office, this is what we do. Actually, it's more than that. How can we start to change the way that our organisations are built, the foundations, our governance, to be based on our values, which is huge. So rather than this kind of paternalistic, this mechanical governance, which is very deficit-based, more negative, more control-based, actually how can we start to look at changing the way we build our organisations to include things like values, for example? So, what does that mean for Guernsey? What does that mean for us here? What does that mean for our children? So much of where we are at the moment, is thinking about, well, yes, well-being and resilience is important. Yes, we need to start doing more of it. Yes, we probably could do a bit more in our organisations. But actually, it's not just a tick box exercise. It's not just half a day on stress management. It's not just taking an extra few days of paternity leave. It's more than that. We've already seen the business case for wellbeing and resilience, especially in times of transformation. It's essential. So, in terms of our own local situation, so much of the time that we have is spent in the workplace. A huge proportion of our time is spent in the workplace. And so if we aim to have thriving employees, not only do we contribute to the economy, but we also potentially end up with thriving partners, thriving parents, thriving community members. We shouldn't forget that people as employees have a huge impact in the wider community as well. And by nurturing resilience and well-being at work, what we can do is start to become stronger as a community to face the challenges of the future. Thank you.